great pleasure to be here. I'm going to try to do all of Eurasia in 20 minutes and get granular at the same time if I possibly can. Keep in mind that technology has not defeated geography. What's happened is something more subtle, that technology has shrunk geography. It's made the world smaller, more claustrophobic, more anxious, more nervous, so that Eurasia, which used to just be a high school geography term because it was too big to actually mean anything, is now increasingly a cohering system of trade, rivalry, and even conflict. And the way to understand it is really through the history of civilizations, empires, dynasties, because all of these powers that are interacting today, whether it's Russia, China, India, Iran, or Turkey, for most of their history, especially early modern history, medieval history, were classified as empires of one kind or another. So we cannot escape the concept of empire, which I'm going to use today as a thought experiment. I'm not going to defend it. I'm just going to use it as a thought experiment in order to understand things. It's sort of the tragedy of history is that empire was required to deliver order of some kind or another, usually. And so now we start. Take China at the beginning. Everyone is talking about the Belt and Road Initiative, or One Belt, One Road. What does it mean? Well, if you layer the trade routes of the Tang Dynasty, the Tang Empire, in the early medieval period, especially the 9th century, on top of the Yuan Dynasty, medieval period, time of Marco Polo, 13th, early 14th century, and you layer them together and look at Marco Polo's path as a geographical framing device for this whole discussion, you will wind up with Belt and Road, with the Belt and Road Initiative. Because the Belt and Road Initiative, when you look at the map of it, is really, it takes its vision from China's medieval dynasties and the trade routes that connected China to Europe during that period. Now, One Belt, One Road is a number of things that do not get emphasized enough in the media. First, it's a branding operation for what the Chinese have already built in terms of roads, railways, pipelines across Central Asia. Again, along Marco Polo's path. These are things that were built before the word Belt and Road Initiative was even discussed. And the purpose of these roads, railways, pipelines, in addition to bringing in hydrocarbons from Central Asia, oil and natural gas, directly into Western China, so that China would be less dependent on the Strait of Malacca, for oil deliveries. The real objective of it is to link China organically with Iran. Iran is the real prize in Belt and Road. Iran is the geographical, geopolitical organizing principle of the greater Middle East. A population of 80 million, highly educated, fronting both hydrocarbon areas, not only the Persian Gulf, but the Caspian Sea as well. And the Chinese are investing in Iran. They're mining for minerals there. They're building railroads. So Belt and Road, like the first thing about it is roads, railways, pipelines, making this organic, unbeatable alliance between China and Iran. And the Tang Dynasty of the 9th century had trade routes right into Khorasan in northeastern Iran. So this is very much in keeping with Chinese history. And the second thing about Belt and Road, again, dealing with the demons of Chinese history, is China is age-old. It goes back to antiquity. But the western part of China, the Muslim Turkic Uyghur area, only joined China in recent centuries. And so Belt and Road does a number of things. It surrounds the Uyghurs by preventing them forever having a rear base in the former Soviet Central Asian Turkic republics. It also lifts up, or intends to lift up, their standard of living by developing these cities, Urumqi, Kashgar, and others, to give them less of an opportunity or less of an incentive to revolt. And by doing that, it does something very unique for China, which is all we read about in China is South China Sea, East China Sea, China building ships, sending ships in. But if you look at it, China actually has a very weak maritime tradition. Except for the early Ming Dynasty in the early 15th century with the treasure fleets of Chonghe, China really wasn't a maritime power. And why wasn't it a maritime power? Because it was too insecure on land in whatever dynasty or empire. And by one belt, one road, it solves this dilemma. It makes China even more secure than it already is, giving China the luxury to concentrate on building a great navy and challenging the United States in the South and East China Sea. It solves this demon in Chinese history. And what is China's goal? Again, we're back to history. While Europe was engaged in Westphalian balance of power politics with periodic wars, Asia in the early modern and modern era, under what was, in comparative terms, a benign tributary system, where China was the top dog, but it was not an overbearing imperialism, really. It was a way to synchronize power relationships. And an academic who brings this out brilliantly is David Kang at the University of Southern California, who does this. So China believes, and the Chinese have spoken about this, that their vision for Asia is a very benign vision that lifts up all boats, makes everybody richer, where they will emphasize, they will orchestrate a kind of weak, benevolent form of former Chinese tributary imperial systems. As the Americans move further and further away from the coast of Asia. Now, moving away from China, we go to Russia. Now, I know that we tend to make a Manichaean dichotomy, a necessary one, between democracy and dictatorship. But there are also other dichotomies. One thing I've learned as a journalist over the decades is that the differences between one authoritarian system and another authoritarian system are often as great as the differences between one authoritarian system and a democratic system. And the Russian system is very different from China. Again, going back to history and geography. Russia covers half the longitudes of the Earth. It's an insecure land power. It has too few geographical barriers to invasion. So that Russia was invaded from the West by, of course, we know, Napoleon and Hitler, but also to some extent by Poles, Lithuanians, Swedes, even Teutonic Knights, etc. So Russia feels very insecure on its western border historically. However, Russia knows that the Warsaw Pact is not coming back. It was too expensive to maintain. What Russia seeks is, I believe, a weak, more traditional form of empire in Central Eastern Europe. But it's a different form of empire than the Chinese empire. Remember, Russia, because it was so insecure, had a tendency towards absolutism, towards outright conquest, far less subtle than the Chinese imperial vision. And so the Russians, you take the Russians. When I was a journalist in Romania in 2012-13, I got very frustrated because I was writing articles that nobody wanted to publish about how Putin was using various forms of subversion in Central Eastern Europe. Trying to buy media through third parties, bribing local politicians, running organized crime operations, using disinformation, cyber campaigns, etc. Because between the end of the Kosovo War and the beginning of the Maidan crisis, Europe, except for the European Economic Union, which was an economic big story, was not sexy in the news for a period. It only happened with Maidan, really, that Europe, people focused on Europe as they did during the 90s in Bosnia and Kosovo, etc. And so the Russian form of subversion is not benign like China. It's not making everyone rich the way China is making everyone kind of rich, especially in Western Australia, in various parts of Asia. Russia is just beating people down, it seems. It's weakening Central Eastern Europe or trying to undermine democratic systems from Estonia in the north to Bulgaria in the south. And this, people say that Putin is a new czar. I believe there are a few liberalizing czars. I mean, czars who are progressive for their time by the standards of that time. And therefore, it's kind of an insult to some czars to compare Putin to him. But because the Russian form of empire was always different from the Chinese, the Russian form of influence, of subversion in Central Eastern Europe is different than what the Chinese have been doing, throughout East Asia. Well, we come to Iran. And if any of you have had the privilege to travel through Iran, as I have, you know that Iran is Iranians have a civilizational sense of themselves as rich as that of Indians, Chinese, or Japanese. And it's a civilization rooted in geography and in empire. Iranians of one form or another have lived on the Iranian plateau since Middle Antiquity. The Achaemenids, the Sassanids, the Medes, the Parthians, the various, Iranian-related empires, most of them basically governed from on or near the Mediterranean Sea eastward to what is today central Afghanistan. And on that map, it's a little bit confusing because there's orange and red, but that's the overlap of the Ottoman and Achaemenid empires. So actually, Iran goes all the way to almost the Mediterranean Sea. And if you look where Iran is influential today, whether by supporting proxy militias, operating in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Syria, etc., and where the Iranian currency circulates in the western half of Afghanistan, you're seeing basically the same contours of Iranian empires of old. The Ayatollahs may be very religious, but there's also an element, a strain of Persian imperialism in how they operate in the greater Middle East, which is, which will be true even in a post-Ayatollah regime if one comes. We can't know the future of Iran, but looking at the past for 2,500 years, we know Iran is always going to be consequential. It's a real state. It's not an artificial contraption. It has deeply rooted institutions, whether under the Ayatollahs or previous empires or governments. It's much more organically defined through history than most Arab countries. There are some exceptions. And one thing I've always found interesting is that what really, in one respect, is empire? Empire is not just invading, it's training proxy militaries. It's training host country militaries to do the imperial policing for you. The British did this, the French did this. The Americans do this with what's called FID, Foreign Internal Defense, where Army Special Forces and certain Marine units train host country militaries. Well, the Iranians are brilliant at this. I would say that the reason they've been so good at training proxy forces in Syria to defend Assad, the reason they were so good at harassing the Americans in Iraq a decade ago, is because this is very much in keeping with an imperial tradition, of using host country forces. Going further along, we have Turkey for a moment. Turkey, of course, the Seljuk Empire, the Ottoman Empire, in medieval history, early modern, and even modern history. And I use the word Ottoman, not Turkish empire, because it was a multi-ethnic empire, of various communities where the Eastern Orthodox had actually better relations with the Muslims than they had with the Western Catholics for a long period of time. It was a very multifaceted, multicultural empire. And when I started reporting from Turkey in the early 1980s, Turkey had a prime minister, Turgut Özal. And Turgut Özal had this philosophy of this policy of neo-Ottomanism, that he was going to use the Ottoman model in order to move closer to the Kurds, because they were both Muslims, closer to the Turkic Central Asians, closer to the Arabs in an economic sense. Well, Özal died very early in 1993. And then we had later on Ahmet Davutoglu, who was Erdogan's foreign minister, who also had an element of an Ottoman power projection policy. Now, these may not have worked out very well at all. Turkey may have misjudged its capacity to actually influence events in the Middle East, in Syria and other places. But my point is only that to understand Turkey and Turkey's goals and its insecurities, you have to look at the Ottoman legacy. Finally, there's India. And here I get to India and China. India, if you look at the map of Indian empires, Mauryan, Kushan, Mughal, and others, you'll find something curious. Often, whoever ruled in Delhi also ruled throughout what is today Pakistan and throughout much of Afghanistan today. Whereas during the Mughal Empire, you often had rule over Pakistan and Afghanistan from Delhi, but the extreme southern part of India was out of the Mughal, out of the Mughal range. So that when Indians care about Afghanistan, and they care deeply about it, it has its basis in history. Afghanistan is not far from India. It's almost part of the subcontinent in that sense. And while China is moving south towards the Indian Ocean, building ports or helping to finance ports throughout the Indian Ocean, ports that I've visited, India is also, engaged in building a route with Iran from the Indian Ocean north through western Afghanistan to counter Pakistani influence deep into Central Asia. So it's the Pakistanis and the Chinese trying to build a route from Gwadar in Pakistan north into western China versus the Indians and the Iranians trying to build an alternative route just to the west from Chabahar north directly into, through western Afghanistan and directly into Central Asia. So the future is actually linking Central Asia to the Indian Ocean. And I emphasize oceans because globalization is a maritime age. 90% of goods that travel from one continent to another do so by sea. Yeah, and let me just close up and state this, that the Indian Ocean is the global energy interstate, taking oil and gas, goes from the Middle East to to the middle-class conurbations in East Asia. And in order to really access the Indian Ocean, the Chinese Navy needs to dominate the South China Sea. And I'll end with this. The Chinese are doing nothing in the South China Sea that the Americans did not do in the Caribbean in the 19th and early 20th century. The American empire of sorts began in the Caribbean by dominating the Western Hemisphere, and the new Chinese empire of sorts begins in the South China Sea to provide access to the Indian Ocean, so China will have a maritime sphere all the way from the East China Sea to Djibouti, where China is building a military installation at the mouth of the Red Sea. And I'll stop.